The Pharisees, this is Mark 7 here, Mark 7, verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the traditions of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Mark is explaining to his readers, who are not Jews, what the Jewish custom of washing is. Now, this is not hygienic washing. Okay, they're not washing their hands to clean themselves of germs, as we might think today. And this is not even legal, lawful washing. This is part of their tradition that they have built up around the law. As I said before, one of the conditions of life in Israel at this point in time, 400 years after the previous, end of the Old Testament period, is that because they had gotten so focused on not falling into idolatry again and getting into a situation where they're going to be exiled, that's a good thing. Okay, that in itself is a good thing. They had learned their lesson from the exile. They scrubbed out their idolatry. They never went back to worshiping idols after the Babylonian exile. But in the time period from the end of the Old Testament till now, here in the Gospel period, in order to keep themselves from even coming close to idolatry, or violating the law, they had built up these sets of teachings and traditions around the law, kind of like a hedge or a fence around the law. And that was what they really emphasized: don't break these things. If you don't break these extra rules that we've written around the law, then you're not going to come close to breaking the law itself. And so all this fussy ceremonial washing falls into that category. They were supposed to wash themselves and wash their clothes when they became unclean in order to become clean again. We even saw Jesus tell the man he healed of leprosy earlier on to do that, to bring his sacrifice to the priest, present himself to the priest, go through the proper procedure of getting clean and wash and all that. But all this extra stuff, all this extra washing was not intended by the law, and it's not hygienic in nature either. I don't like to eat until I wash my hands either, but I do that for hygienic purposes with soap and water, not for some kind of ceremonial purpose, which is largely made up in my own mind and not even commanded by God. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples..." Now remember, the Pharisees themselves were a non-professional class, in the sense that the Sadducees were the ones who actually controlled the priesthood. And the priests, remember, were supposed to be only male descendants of the line of Aaron. It was very exclusive. You could only be a priest if you met very specific physical genealogical criteria. You had to be a male descendant of the line of Aaron to be a priest. And the Sadducees were large. Now, the high priesthood was even more exclusive. You had to be a high priest from a certain line within the priesthood. At that point, that's faded. The high priesthood is now just an office that rotates, a political office basically that rotates. That's long gone. The whole idea of the high priesthood being of a certain line of priests is centuries gone by this point. But the Sadducees controlled the priesthood, and the Pharisees were the lay people. You could think of it kind of like the Sadducees were like the politicians, like the DC types, the people who were in Jerusalem, who were in DC, in our day. And the Pharisees are kind of like the media, who do their bidding. And they're kind of opposed to them, but kind of not. Like they're not priests. The Pharisees themselves are not priests. They are a class of lay people, but they're very zealous for their traditions that they try to enforce on everybody. In order, again, the traditions themselves are rooted in the desire to not let the nation sink back into idolatry. So it's rooted in an upright desire, but it's been twisted into something very corrupt. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live?" And you have to remember, again, and I know I'm taking my time getting through this, but in the centuries since the exile, they developed this synagogue system, probably during the exile. And the synagogue was based in local communities. And that's where the whole teacher of the law thing comes in. Each community would have had someone who was like the official or the expert. Again, usually a layperson, not a priest. A priesthood was still centered in the temple. Because officially, all their religious activities are supposed to take place in the temple. So that these teachers of the law would have been like local synagogue people who would have taught the people. The priests were supposed to do that. The original setup behind their system was that the priests were going to live, and the Levites were going to live kind of scattered around the country and do that, but that isn't how it ended up working out. So anyway, so now the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders?" And again, they're not even saying according to the law here, just the traditions of the elders, instead of eating their food with unclean hands. He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men." Isaiah 29:13. Let's go back and read that a little bit, just to get a flavor of that passage. Oops. Yeah, that's right. Isaiah 29:13, the Lord says, "These people come near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is made up only of rules taught by men. Therefore, once more I will astound these people with wonder upon wonder." Jesus was doing that, although they didn't want to accept it. "The wisdom of the wise will perish. The intelligence of the intelligent will vanish." You have let go of the commands of Jesus, talking to the Pharisees again. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And he said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death.' But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever help you might have otherwise received from me is Corban,' that is, a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother." So basically what he's saying is that, well, let me finish this. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And you do many things like that. Let's go back and take a look at kind of what we're talking about. Let's go back and look at some of the actual scriptural laws from which they derived this extra teaching that allowed them to escape helping out their... I'm assuming we're talking about elderly parents here. We're not talking about a young child who's still under the care of his father or mother. We're talking about adults whose fathers and mothers are still alive and are elderly and need their assistance now. Leviticus 27:28 says this. Leviticus 27:28. "But nothing that a man owns and devotes to the Lord, whether man or animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord." So if you say you're going to give something to the God, you've got to give that to God. We saw that back in the Exodus and the conquest when they were told to give some things up to God of Jericho. You're supposed to give it all up to God. You can't take any of it. Saul got in trouble for that when he was fighting the Amalekites, and God wanted him to give it all to him and not take any of it. You can do that. You could have done that yourself. You could have made that individual choice to take something that was your possession and devote to the Lord, whether man or animal or family land. And if you did that, that thing belonged to the God now. You couldn't buy it back. You couldn't redeem it. Okay? So that is part of what we're talking about here. Then reading more about vows, let's go to Numbers. All about Numbers 30. Chapter 30 is about vows. Now most of this chapter is about limiting the ability of women to make vows, putting them under the authorities of their fathers or husbands. But the beginning of this chapter is Numbers 30. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said." That's very important. One of the worst things you could possibly do, it's right there, is make a vow to the Lord and not fulfill that vow. That's actually what the second commandment is. Taking the name of the Lord in vain really means making an oath to the Lord and not fulfilling it. Now we think about it in terms of like not saying curse words, and there is an element of that too. There is a that's connected to it in terms of not uttering a curse in the name of the Lord. But really, what it means is don't say you're going to do something. Don't invoke God's name to say you're going to do something and then not do that something. If you invoke God's name to say you're going to do something, you better do that something, even if it's bad. Honestly, as you read about with Jephthah in the book of Judges. Even if you make a foolish vow, it's better to fulfill that foolish vow. You're better off not making a vow at all, as Jesus says, and we'll read about that in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. It's better not to make a vow at all. But if you're going to make a vow, even a foolish vow, it's better to fulfill that vow than to make a vow and then break it. That's bad. That's way up on the list of bad things you could do. Numbers 18 now, in verse 8 says this, starting in verse 8, "Then the Lord said to Aaron the priest, I myself have put you in charge of the offerings presented to me. I give to you and your sons all the holy offerings of the Israelites. All the holy offerings the Israelites give me, I give to you and your sons as your portion in your regular share. You are to have the part of the most holy offerings that is kept from the fire. From all the gifts they bring me as most holy offerings, whether grain or sin or guilt offerings, that part belongs to you and your sons." Okay, and then he goes on to talk more about stuff like that. So that's the basis of what is going on here. People were allowed, they weren't forced, but they were allowed and encouraged to make these kinds of offerings, these free will offerings, to set aside something of their own that is to the Lord. And once you did that, it couldn't be used for anything else. The priest got a portion of that once you offered it. Once you took your sacrifice at the altar and did all that, part of that could be used by the priest as their portion. But they have gone beyond that and have made it so that they can kind of give themselves a back door not to use their gifts or their money or their things to help their parents or other people who might be in their debt or in their obligation to take care of, by saying, well, I devoted it to God, so you can't have it. So they were using that as an excuse. They had built a web around these laws to allow themselves to find ways not to follow the actual law, to find technicalities to allow them to escape their proper duties. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." Now that is going to be a shocker to these people. They're not going to understand that. That is going to take, even the apostles are not going to understand that. This is going to be a vast, vast change to everything that they've grown up believing and everything that their people have believed for 1,500 years. Like that is a significant change from what they were used to. After, because they were all about the dietary law, superior law, it shall be unclean. Like they had that hard code into their beings. Like that is going to be a huge world shift in their worldview. And they're not going to get. Not only are they not going to get that until after Jesus is gone, they're not even going to get that until well into the church. They're going to still have problems with that decades from now. Paul's going to write about that in Galatians. That Peter, even at that point in time, 20, 30 years later, is still going to be having trouble with this. Like this is going to be a tough one for them. they're going to have to overcome not only their own lifetimes of teaching otherwise, but generations upon generations of teaching otherwise. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach." By that he means the well of thought and emotion that makes you up, makes you you. But into his stomach, and from there, out of his body. In saying this, and you almost see this in parentheses here in your English Bibles. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. In fact, the apostles didn't even realize what he was saying until many years later, after they were spent many years ruminating on it and thinking about it. It's like, because they had been taught all their lives, and their parents have been taught all their lives, and their grandparents have been taught all their lives not to eat certain unclean foods. It shall be unclean for you. The foods themselves were declared unclean. And that would have been just a big deal. So having that overturned just like that that would leave their heads spinning. Their world, you might as well stand them upside down and make them walk on their hands. And that would have been a vast change to their worldview. He went on. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. From within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All of these evils come from inside, and that's what makes you unclean.